In December of 2024, Luigi Mangione allegedly murdered the chief executive officer of United Healthcare in presumed revenge for the way health insurers abuse citizens. Upon investigating the killer's profile, it was discovered that he was an admirer of a character who unleashed chaos in the United States for 18 years, Ted Kaczynski. Ted could have gotten away with it and ended his criminal career in anonymity, but his plans fell apart on September 19th, 1995. That day, a man named David opened the newspaper and found something that left him breathless. In the center page, an extensive manifesto full of hatred, resentment, and ideas as deep as they were controversial had been published. It was signed by the well-known Unabomber, a nickname given to the culprit of several deaths. A subject who had eluded the authorities and now had extorted the country's major newspapers with a simple promise. If his words were published, he would withdraw. What surprised David the most, however, was not so much the chilling content of that note. What made him pale that morning in front of his coffee cup was realizing that there were expressions in those words that were familiar to him. Very familiar, to be honest. With a trembling pulse, he called his wife and had her read the Unabomber's note. He could tell by her expressions that she was coming to the same conclusion as him. They knew who had written that. There was no doubt. That day, David had discovered that the most wanted man in the country was none other than his brother Ted, who had been in some kind of seclusion in the middle of the forest for years. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What did David do after discovering this? How did Ted become the Unabomber? How were the CIA and MK Ultra involved in all of this? What happened to Ted once justice got its hands on him? Why do many still consider him an inspiration today? What did David say when he found out that Luigi Mangione had mentioned his brother a few months before committing his murder? Trying to answer these questions will lead us to know the dark case of the Unabomber. A genius is born. When Ted was born on May 22, 1942, no one imagined that they were facing the person who would make the Federal Bureau of Investigation spend millions and millions just a few years in the future. For nearly 3 decades, Ted raised no suspicions and instead did the opposite. At a very young age, Ted Kaczynski was considered a child prodigy of Polish-American family. The little boy quickly stood out for his ease with numbers. He was somewhat withdrawn when it came to socializing with his other peers, yes, but it was undeniable that he also seemed to have a kind of gift. His passion for mathematics extended beyond the classroom. At home, Ted never missed an opportunity to read manuals that would help him understand more and more of this world that amazed him. It's widely believed that kids dislike vegetables and anything involving lengthy calculations. We don't know how Ted got along with food, but we can assure that he loved challenges, which included complicated equations. On more than one occasion, teachers were somewhat skeptical of his premature abilities. They thought the boy was cheating or there was some trick to what he was doing, but no. Ted could go to the blackboard in the blink of an eye, solve accounts that disoriented his classmates. Any doubt that was around him was completely cleared when in 5th grade he was subjected to an intelligence test. It was then known that Ted had a higher than usual intellectual coefficient. Much higher, to be exact. The consequences of that rewarded him by making him skip several grades, several courses. Well, even rewarded is a way of saying much later, Ted would reflect on it and say that there his fate had begun to twist at the precise moment when they had begun to treat him like a genius. Surrounded by older boys, he quickly became the object of ridicule. For everyone, he was a kind of weird and spoiled bug by the educational authorities. If there was any small chance for Ted to adapt to his environment, it shattered that season. The young man began to develop a natural fear towards other people, and his mother considered sending him to a special school. However, all his teachers kept mentioning that his brain was something fascinating, that he had to be given the opportunity to develop everything that was inside him. The truth is that Ted kept skipping more and more years, and by the age of 16 he was already a college graduate. Not content with this, he got his doctorate, and at 25 he was an assistant professor at prestigious institutions. His case merited him being written about, awarded prizes, and his shelves filled with mentions and medals. He also published in scientific journals, and his theses were studied as if they were theses written by masters of yesteryear. He also broke scoring records and even had the luxury of finding solutions to mathematical enigmas that had been driving other number lovers crazy for years. It was even said that it was likely that no more than 10 people in the United States could handle his level of abstraction with such fullness and accuracy. Nothing seemed too difficult for him. Nothing, except living in harmony with others. This still proved to be impossible. Few even knew that in his search for a place to meet people, Ted had participated from 1959 to 1962 as a guinea pig in terrible experiments. Experiments linked with the CIA and MKULTRA. Ted's contacts with the CIA had begun when the boy was still in college. We don't know if he was called up precisely because of his high performance or if he volunteered precisely driven by his enormous curiosity. What is known is that Ted was under the command of Henry Munray, a renowned professor who had founded the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and who would play a crucial role in one of the most nefarious projects carried out by the United States government. We're talking about MKUltra. Over time, MKUltra came to be defended as an ethically indefensible experiment. This project aimed to achieve mind control through various methodologies that could include shock therapy, experimentation with lysergic acid diethylamide hypnosis, and a long and terrible etc. To worsen the situation, it was all done secretly, without properly obtaining the participants' consent. They were told that their signs would be monitored while they discussed philosophy, but in reality, they were exposed to a prolonged and stressful psychological attack. The idea was to find a way to break those minds in order to find a place to filter subliminal messages or orders. These human trials were intended to identify and develop new substances and procedures usable in interrogations and torture. And what happened next? Ted himself would say that nothing important or noteworthy happened. But the big question is, isn't that exactly what the subject would say if the experiment had gone exactly as his superiors had hoped? What if they had destroyed his sanity and then hidden the damage? CIA operatives used universities, hospitals, prisons, and pharmaceutical companies as a front for their terrible purposes. At least until 1975, when the Church Committee of the United States Congress, which was investigating abuses committed by intelligence services, set its sights on them. In that same year, the CIA director suspiciously ordered all MKUltra documents to be destroyed. Many conspiracy theorists can't help but notice the step of Ted through Murray's unscrupulous dealings, wondering if it wasn't the CIA that was responsible for finally unbalancing a brain that was already oscillating between genius and horror. One way or another, after participating in these experiments that would be repudiated years later, Ted would get some scholarships, more awards, and soon more and better job opportunities would rain down on them. His extensive curriculum made it clear he had the world at his feet. But that didn't motivate him. Ted didn't want to have the world at his feet. He simply wanted to watch it burn. And the first step for that to start happening would be at 27 years old. At that moment, the man gave up all the positions that had been offered to him and moved back in with his parents without giving further explanations. His colleagues couldn't understand what was happening. Ted was giving up a reality in which he was acclaimed to seclude himself in the room that had seen him grow up. They assumed he might feel overwhelmed, that maybe he needed time, that it was a crisis that would end sooner or later, but it wasn't like that. Ted would never be who he used to be again. From that moment on, the Unabomber began to take shape. A man against the future. After spending 2 years living in the small Illinois residence and working alongside his father and brother, a quiet Ted moved again. This time he headed towards Lincoln. He ventured into a forest area, bought some land thanks to some loans, built a humble cabin, and announced to the four winds that this would now be his life. The place had no electricity or running water, so once again those closest to him thought it wouldn't be long before the man gave up on such an extreme idea. But just as Ted had stood firm in not returning to work at the universities where he had been on the honor roll, he was equally firm in his conviction not to return to a more conventional life. His few quick neighbors got used to his presence and his silence. Ted's hair and beard had grown. He no longer wore those suits he used to wear to teach or give lectures in luxury buildings. Now he hunted and harvested, boasted about needing little money, and did occasional maintenance work. All that he had studied no longer had value in his new context, in that seemingly simple life away from the vertigo of society. The change was drastic, of course, but it was also true that Ted, as we saw, was not exactly characterized as a person who enjoyed being surrounded by other human beings. As the months went by, everyone understood that he had finally given in to his deepest nature, and they got used to not seeing him anymore. Few knew that in that act of Ted there was an absolute declaration of principles. Apart from being lonely, Ted had become an increasingly stubborn person. He was always frowning and angry. Not only did he fail to fit in, he despised society as a whole. Ted had rooted resentment and grumbled about the need to destroy modern industrial society, which he described as alienating. He argued that man had detached himself from his most basic instincts and was heading towards a future that would leave him devoid of emotions and enslaved. Ted didn't want that for himself. He believed that humans should return to living in small, self-sustaining communities. When someone had labeled his idea as utopian, his hatred had been ignited. The most optimistic speculated that Ted could now be happier, but Ted was not in his peaceful retirement and did not spend his hours alone contemplating the course of his existence. Behind others' backs, Ted had set out to make himself heard. And what better way to make oneself heard than with an explosion or several? The bombs are starting to arrive. In 1978, a materials engineering professor at Northwestern University in Illinois received a suspicious package. Suspicious, he alerted the police. No one usually sent him packages, and besides, his details did not seem to be written correctly. The responding officer believed the caller was exaggerating. While he was handling the package, it exploded in his hand, seriously injuring him. It was indeed a bomb package. Investigations began immediately. Why had someone sent it? Was it a personal issue with a particular professor? What kind of message was that bomb intended to convey? All the questions still remained unanswered a few months later. It was May of 1979 when a second package similar to the first arrived at the same university. This time the explosion injured a student. This event made those who had hoped that the first bomb was an isolated incident change their minds. There was undoubtedly someone with malicious intentions. Someone who had developed a modus operandi and was eager to attract attention. The definitive break in the case, however, came with the third bomb, which arrived 6 months later. That package did not reach Northwestern University or any other. The third explosive device was found on a plane going from Chicago to Washington and was discovered by chance as it had started to smoke. If the timer hadn't failed, that bomb would have exploded with the plane in the air, causing a disaster of enormous proportions. Fortunately, it all came down to some poisonings and an emergency landing that left many passengers on the verge of a panic attack. Just a big scare, but things were escalating too quickly. Experts immediately agreed that it was the same individual who had sent the packages to the universities. He had a unique method of making his deadly weapons. As attacking an airplane qualifies as a federal crime, from that moment on the case was handed over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A press release was made, and they referred to the criminal they were looking for as a bomber, a name that sought to shorten the following description: University and Airline Bomber, that is, a bomber of universities and airlines. All the people who traveled on the plane of the third attack were investigated. They tried to create connections. They seemed vague. It was impossible to try to guess where or against whom the next attack could be carried out. In fact, the Unabomber would carry out 13 more attacks without them being able to walk with him, all over the course of 18 years. In the process, he would leave more than 20 injured and 3 dead. Hugh Scruton, owner of the Rustic Computer Store, a computer services company in Sacramento, California, found a package in the parking lot of his store during this reign of terror. It was the sunny morning of December 11th, 1985. Hugh had looked at the package for a long time. He knew that opening a package when you don't know the sender is potentially dangerous, but curiosity got the better of him and he decided to open it. The blast launched him airborne. Thus, Hugh became the first fatal victim of the Unabomber. There were more explosions, more injuries, scars, amputated fingers, but it would be 9 years before another death was recorded. Thomas Mosser was the executive vice president of a global advertising company. On December 10, 1994, he received a package at his home. Opening it was the last thing he did before he ceased to exist. He was 50 years old and his wife and daughter were injured in the explosion. The damage to his home was evidence of the perfection that the Unabomber's methods had achieved. A few months later, Gilbert Murray, president of the California Forestry Association, died after opening a shoebox that had arrived at his office. The checks were increasing and new investigators were joining the case, but the Unabomber remained an enigma. It was clear that he was a meticulous professional who knew what he was doing and also knew how to go unnoticed. In fact, by that time, some personalities from the Federal Bureau of Investigation had ventured some ideas about the criminal's identity. John Douglas, famous for creating the psychological profile of serial criminals for the investigation agency, assured that Unabomber was a man with above-average intelligence, higher education in sciences, and probably a follower of the neo-Luddite philosophy. Neo-Luddism is a current that opposes the technological and scientific development of society because it considers them harmful to human beings. Oftentimes, its followers also adhere to an idea of sabotage against anything that promotes or generates industrialization. The psychological profile presented by Douglas was discarded in 1993 when another theory began to gain strength, according to which the Unabomber had to be an airplane mechanic. Around those years, the 1-800-701 bomb was established, a number that was opened exclusively to receive civilian clues that could help find the culprit causing so much confusion. At the same time, a millionaire reward was established for anyone who could provide crucial information. And what did that lead to? Thousands of opportunistic calls, thousands of dead ends, and a kind of collective hysteria where everyone began to distrust everyone. As far as they knew, anyone could be the Unabomber. In this tense atmosphere, the subject chose to write a letter to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In it, he made a proposal to those who were pursuing him. He committed to abandon his criminal actions if the country's main newspapers published a 30,000-word text written by him, a manifesto called Industrial Society and Its Future. They had to publish it in full, without censorship. The authorities faced a significant dilemma. If they published the Unabomber's words, they ran the risk that others would see his cause as just and want to join him. But also publishing that could give them some clues about the criminal's identity. After a strenuous analysis, they chose to accept the blackmail, and that's how our story goes back to the beginning. The Manifesto. The Unabomber signed his manifesto as Freedom Club, that is, Club of Freedom. In it, he claimed that the Industrial Revolution had been a disaster for humanity and urged all men and women to rebel against the established order, returning to a more natural behavior. In the text, he also referred to over-socialized people who repress their inclinations, their emotions, and feel ashamed when their behavior or speech are contrary to the expectations imposed from the outside. Based on this, Unabomber asserted that freedom was being limited at a rapid pace and that soon we would be able to do nothing to escape. According to him, we were very close to the point of no return. As suspected, the manifesto generated followers, but it also generated a lot of phone calls. Many people were sure that those expressions resembled those of a family member or someone they knew. All were unfounded fears, all except those of David Kaczynski. David read some phrases and had no doubt that his brother had written them. He had already heard him saying the same thing and using the same metaphors and forms. He let his wife know about the situation, and they both agreed that before making the corresponding accusation, they had to make sure, so they hired a private detective to find out things about Ted. In a few weeks, the investigator was able to locate the man's cabin and was able to gather some evidence that confirmed that explosives were being manufactured there. The next thing David did was call the Federal Bureau of Investigation and negotiate. Through lawyers, he said he would hand over Unabomber in exchange for assurances that he would not be harmed in the arrest process. The agents analyzed the evidence presented, did their own work comparing the published manifesto and other texts from Ted, and came to the same conclusion as David. They had finally reached this man who had become a total headache in recent decades. On April 3, 1996, the Unabomber was arrested and his identity was finally revealed. Last year's legacy. The first psychological test that Ted underwent yielded compelling results. He had schizophrenia and paranoia. In fact, this diagnosis would have been beneficial when formulating a sentence. However, the man refused to be considered insane and pleaded guilty, conscious and proud of all the federal charges brought against him. After labeling his lawyers and his family as traitors, Ted had defended himself alone, appearing erratic and without any remorse. He took every opportunity he could to continue expressing his anti-technology ideas. The sentence against him translated into a life sentence that was to be carried out in one of the maximum security prisons in the United States and the world. Within this block of concrete where the most dangerous criminals reside, there is a special module where, among others, El Chapo Guzman, those responsible for planning the attack on the World Trade Center in 1993, some brains behind 9/11, and spies who ended up working by sending secret information to the Russian Federation. Ted entered that completely isolated module. However, what could be torture for many was not so much for him. Years into his prison sentence, he declared that being away from everyone and having the opportunity to meditate and read was not bad at all. In short, he had all he desired there. He also took the opportunity to study languages, took psychology courses, and his good behavior allowed him to listen to music a few days a week. At a certain point, he began to correspond with hundreds of people. In 2021, he was moved to a different North Carolina prison due to health issues. He died on June 10, 2023 at the age of 81. It was unclear if his death was due to illness or suicide. Today, the University of Michigan archives the over 400 letters he received and wrote. In all of them, you can continue to read the deepening of his ideas. The cabin that was Kaczynski's laboratory had become an object of public fascination and forensic importance since his arrest in 1996. It was moved in its entirety to different warehouses and even photographed as part of an artistic project. Today it is believed that this cabin, so small but so significant in meaning, is somehow the poetic representation of Ted's mental state. Luigi Mangione, the man whom the police identified on December 9, 2024 as the murderer of the chief executive officer of United Healthcare, had written a review of Kaczynski's manifesto on a website. There he described Ted in the following way. It's easy to quickly and reflexively label it as the manifesto of a lunatic, but we would be avoiding confronting some of the uncomfortable problems it identifies. It's simply impossible to ignore how clairvoyant many of his predictions about modern society turned out to be. He closed his critique with the following sentence further down. Ted was a violent individual who mutilated innocent people. Although these actions tend to be characterized as those of a mad technology opponent, they are more accurately seen as those of an extreme political revolutionary. After it became known that Luigi had used his brother as inspiration, David came out to speak in front of the television cameras and asked that violent acts not be romanticized or normalized, which are only destined to generate more and more destruction. For many, the controversy remains, and there is much more than it seems in the feverish paragraphs written by Ted. Others see it as a kind of virus and hope that sooner or later its message will stop spreading to no longer cause more deaths. One way or another, it is clear that even though Kaczynski is no longer alive or no longer distributing bombs, the shockwave of his legacy is still in effect.